God, how cool is this?
Major Second Amendment case.
Major Supreme Court ruling.
And today, the Supreme Court has answered that question by a vote of 6-3.
Justice's ruling this morning, it conflicts with the Second Amendment's right to bear arms.
Everybody has a right if they're a responsible adult.
The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
It's a case that legal experts will be watching closely.
Within 72 hours of a single court decision, 4 separate federal lawsuits were filed. Magazine sales exploded by 340% in just 48 hours. A firearms distributor in Texas moved more inventory in 5 days than they typically sell in an entire quarter. And over 2 million background checks flooded the system in 2 weeks, representing a 190% spike compared to the same period the previous year. This wasn't panic buying driven by fear. This was something entirely different. This was an entire industry responding to what many experts are calling the most significant expansion of Second Amendment protections in modern American history, and the shockwaves are still rippling outward. The Supreme Court didn't just make a ruling about magazines, they fundamentally restructured how every gun restriction in America will be evaluated from this point forward. And the implications are so massive that state attorneys general are scrambling. Federal legislation is being rewritten, and gun owners who waited decades for legal clarity are finally making moves they never thought they'd be able to make. So let's break down exactly what happened, why the response has been so explosive, and what this means for the future of firearms law across every single state.
San Francisco-based Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has overturned California's ban on high-capacity gun magazines, saying it violates the Second Amendment.
This spring, the Supreme Court handed down a 6-3 ruling that threw out magazine capacity restrictions. But the decision went far deeper than just magazines. The majority opinion established something critical. There was absolutely no historical evidence from the founding era that Americans were ever told how much ammunition their firearms could hold. Justice Thomas drove the point home with clarity. The Second Amendment protects arms that are in common use. And when you examine the facts, there are over 100 million standard capacity magazines owned by regular civilians across the United States. There's nothing uncommon or unusual about them whatsoever. But here's where things get genuinely interesting and why this decision is sending shockwaves through state capitals. The court didn't stop at addressing magazines. They reinforced and strengthened the Bruen standard to such a degree that virtually every gun restriction passed in the last 50 years is now vulnerable to constitutional challenge. We're talking about assault weapon bans, handgun rosters, purchase permits, waiting periods, and even certain regulations under the National Firearms Act. Everything is suddenly back on the table for legal scrutiny. The attorneys general in California, New York, and New Jersey issued public statements trying to downplay the ruling's significance. But their legal teams know exactly what's coming. The floodgates just opened, and there's no closing them again. Within 3 days of the decision, lawsuits were already hitting federal courts challenging state-level gun laws using this exact ruling as their constitutional foundation.
This case could reshape how far states can restrict your right to carry and where.
There is a difference between states deciding how they want to regulate any number of things versus stripping people of their rights to self-defense.
The legal landscape transformed overnight. The market response was absolutely unprecedented. Brownells reported magazine sales jumping 340% in the first 2 days alone. Magpul couldn't keep their PMag 30-round magazines in stock for longer than 6 hours at a stretch. Palmetto State Armory's website crashed twice from overwhelming traffic volume. Buyers in states that had restricted these items for years, sometimes decades, were rushing to purchase products they'd been legally prohibited from owning since before some of them were even born. But magazines were just the beginning. AR-15 sales surged 280% nationwide in the week immediately following the ruling. Buyers in California, Maryland, and Massachusetts were finally able to purchase rifles with features that had been banned under state assault weapon laws. Those laws are now being challenged in court using the Supreme Court precedent as their legal foundation. One Texas firearms distributor told industry analysts something remarkable. They moved more inventory in 5 days than they typically move in 3 months. Let that sink in for a moment. The NACS background check system, which processes every legal gun purchase in America, handled over 2.1 million checks in the 2 weeks after the decision. That's a 190% increase compared to the identical time period the previous year. And here's what makes this surge genuinely fascinating. This wasn't fear-driven panic buying like what happens when people worry about impending bans. This was celebration buying. Gun owners who had been legally restricted for decades finally felt like constitutional protections were actually working in their favor for once. Ammunition sales followed the exact same explosive pattern. Federal, Winchester, and Hornady all reported back orders extending into the following quarter. The entire supply chain was straining under demand levels nobody had anticipated. Now here's something that caught industry analysts completely off guard. First-time gun buyers represented 38% of all firearm purchases in the month following the Supreme Court ruling. According to data from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, that's the highest percentage of new buyers recorded since the pandemic surge in 2020. But there's a critical difference. Unlike 2020, these people weren't buying out of fear or because of social unrest. These were individuals purchasing because they finally felt they had clear legal protection to exercise a constitutional right without navigating legal minefields. Women accounted for 42% of new gun purchases during this period. That's the highest percentage of female buyers ever recorded in modern tracking history. Gun store owners in New Jersey reported that approximately half their customers after the ruling were people who had never owned a firearm before in their lives. These were individuals who had been waiting for legal clarity and certainty before making a purchase decision. They wanted constitutional protection, not legal ambiguity. Competitive shooters who had been constrained by magazine restrictions for years started placing bulk orders. One USPSA competitor in California purchased 17 magazines in a single transaction. Just months earlier, that exact same purchase would have resulted in felony criminal charges. Hunters began upgrading to semi-automatic rifles with standard capacity magazines for hog hunting and predator control. These were firearm setups they had deliberately avoided before because of legal gray areas they didn't want to navigate. Even law enforcement officers purchasing firearms for personal use, not for official duty, saw a significant increase in their buying activity. The states that had these restrictions in place aren't surrendering without a fight, but they're losing ground rapidly. California's Attorney General announced within a week that the state would pursue legislative workarounds to maintain restrictions. New York proposed legislation requiring microstamping technology on all semi-automatic firearms, which is essentially a backdoor ban because the technology doesn't exist reliably at commercial scale. Illinois attempted to get creative by redefining what legally qualifies as a magazine, claiming that anything detachable is actually a feeding device not covered by the Supreme Court ruling. These aren't good faith attempts at public safety policy. These are desperate maneuvers to avoid complying with what the Supreme Court explicitly stated. But here's the enormous problem these states now face. Federal judges are no longer going along with these delay tactics and semantic games. A federal district court in Maryland issued a temporary restraining order blocking enforcement of the state's assault weapon ban just 11 days after the Supreme Court decision. The judge directly cited the ruling and stated the state failed to meet the historical burden required under Bruen. New Jersey's magazine ban is currently under preliminary injunction while litigation continues moving forward. Massachusetts had to suspend enforcement of its handgun roster after a federal court ruled the state couldn't demonstrate a founding-era equivalent. These aren't minor procedural setbacks. These are entire regulatory frameworks collapsing under constitutional scrutiny. Gun rights organizations like the Firearms Policy Coalition and Second Amendment Foundation are being highly strategic. They're forum shopping, deliberately filing cases in circuits where judges will apply strict constitutional analysis. And the strategy is proving remarkably effective. On the federal legislative level, there are bills moving through Congress that most people aren't paying attention to, but absolutely should be. Republican lawmakers introduced the Lawful Commerce and Firearms Act expansion. This legislation would strip federal funding from any state that continues enforcing gun laws ruled unconstitutional by federal courts. The bill has 23 co-sponsors and is quietly gaining momentum in committee. If it passes, states like California and New York could lose hundreds of millions in federal law enforcement grants if they keep enforcing magazine bans or assault weapon restrictions after courts strike them down. On the other side, Democratic senators proposed the Firearm Safety Compliance Act, which would require federal review of all state gun laws to ensure they meet minimum safety standards. It's essentially attempting to create a federal floor for gun control, even if the Supreme Court says otherwise. Neither bill is likely to pass in a divided Congress, but the fact they're being seriously debated reveals how massive the Supreme Court ruling's impact truly is. But there's another piece of legislation actually gaining real traction. The Hearing Protection Act, which would remove suppressors from NFA regulation, has been reintroduced with 42 co-sponsors. That's the most support it's ever received. Lawmakers are using the Supreme Court's logic about arms in common use, arguing that with over 2 million registered suppressors in civilian hands, they clearly meet that constitutional standard. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that removing the NFA tax stamp requirement could add $200 million annually to the firearms industry and increase suppressor ownership by 600% within 5 years. So what does all this mean for your wallet and your constitutional rights? Standard capacity magazines that were selling for $40 to $60 in restricted states because of limited supply and legal risk are now dropping to $12 to $18. That's identical pricing to what you'd find in free states. AR-15 prices have stabilized after the initial surge, but manufacturers are ramping up production, expecting sustained long-term demand. If you live in a state that previously banned standard features, you can now purchase firearms that cost 30 to 40% less because you're no longer paying premiums for compliance modifications. But the financial impact extends far beyond just purchase prices. Homeowners insurance companies in some states are beginning to recognize lawfully owned firearms as property protection measures, leading to slightly reduced premiums for gun owners who complete certified training courses. The concealed carry insurance market has grown 190% in the past year as more people in previously restrictive states are now legally carrying firearms. Estate planning attorneys are reporting increased demand for gun trusts as collectors want to ensure their newly legal firearms can transfer to heirs without legal complications. Some financial advisors are even recommending firearms and ammunition as alternative inflation-resistant assets, which makes sense considering how supply constraints and political uncertainty affect pricing in this market. From a legal perspective, if you're in a state where laws are currently being challenged, you're in a waiting game. Some gun owners are making purchases now while they can. Others are waiting for complete legal clarity before acting. The Supreme Court ruling fundamentally transformed how gun laws will be evaluated moving forward, and we're watching the effects ripple through every aspect of the firearms industry and legal system. Whether you're a first-time buyer, a competitive shooter, a hunter, or someone who's been waiting for legal certainty, this decision opened doors that remained closed for decades in many parts of the country. The constitutional landscape just shifted in a way that favors gun owners like never before in modern history. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.